The last 2 days in our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, we've been looking at some of our positions in Christ that we normally probably wouldn't gravitate toward, that we're the prisoners of the Lord, that we are the slaves of the Lord, and yet I hope as we explained those, we saw the glory in being a slave of Christ and a prisoner of Christ and all the benefits that are involved with that. But today we balance that out with probably a happier theme, and that is that we are freed from sin. We're going to go today to Romans chapter 6 and take a look at what that means. He says in verse 1, he says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase?" Then he says, "May it never be. How shall we who had died to sin still live in it?" And so he tells us here that we have died to sin. We've been set free from sin. And as we think about that, that's a hard thing to swallow, isn't it? You and I know that we battle with sin. We have not, sin has not ceased to be an issue in our lives. We struggle with it every day, sometimes outwardly with things we do or say, sometimes inwardly with our attitudes and so forth. And so we know of the truth of sin. And if we don't recognize the sinfulness in our lives and our gravitation towards sin, if we don't see that, then there's something delusional, I think, about us. We know we are sinners. We know we deal with that. And so when we come to the scriptures that tell us we're dead to sin, we want to understand what that really means to us. So let's press on a little bit and see what it has to say to us here. It says in verse 5, for example, if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, that is, we have died in Christ, with Christ, who has died for us, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Just as Christ died for us, he also resurrected from the dead. If we are in Christ, there's a sense in which we have died with Christ to sin, and we have been resurrected to a newness of life. Knowing this, he says that our old man was crucified with him, the old self, what we used to be, is crucified with Christ, in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we are no longer to be slaves to sin. So now what he's talking about is this. Because we have died with Christ to sin, because of that, sin no longer is our master. Sin no longer is the one that needs to call the shots in our lives. Sin no longer has dibs on us. We're out from under its mastery. We're out from under its power and its dominance. We now serve a new master. And so it's very important that we see that it doesn't mean that we're free from the temptations of sin. Doesn't mean we'll not sin in the future. But it does mean that we no longer have to sin as we once did. We're no longer under the mastery of sin. Going back to verse 4, which I skipped, it said this, "Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." Now, some of this is pretty heavy stuff, and you want to meditate on it. But if we can pull out of this what it says at the end of verse 4, because we have died with Christ, because we've been resurrected with Christ, we now walk in newness of life. So dying to sin, dying to that power of sin, enables us now to live a new life. We're not what we once were. We're new creatures in Christ. We now no longer are under the mastery of sin. We're under the mastery of Christ. And that gives us the privilege of walking in newness of life. We go down to verse 6 again. Let me explain that. It says, let me reading that again, "Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we're no longer slaves to sin. For he who has died has been justified from sin." Now, the Lord is not saying through the Apostle Paul here that sin is eradicated and gone. He's not saying that. He is saying that we've died to its power. And because we've died to its power, we have been justified from sin. Justified means to be made righteous. We've been legally declared righteous in the Lord. So that puts us in a position now of not an eradication of sin or desire to sin, but a removal of from under its dominance, so that we walk in the newness of life, so we're no longer under its power, no longer slaves to sin, because we have been set free and justified from sin. We have been declared set free from sin. Now we are in the process of living out that newness of life that Christ has given to us. Not in perfection until the Lord comes and gives us a new body and a new heart, but we're in that process of living out what God has done in us as Christians. We have been set free from sin. We have died to sin. That's a glorious truth that I trust will give you a wonderful day in the Lord.